Bram Stoker's Dracula created the most popular image we have today of vampires. It really set the stage for almost everything that we think we know about them. And yet, when you take a look at the history of vampires, it turns out that they're a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than the kind of creature Stoker created. It turns out that looking at what people thought about vampires, what people believed about vampires over the centuries, reveals a lot about us and about human culture and how it has changed over time. What most people don't realize is that there were actually vampire scares in the United States, in New England, as late as 1892. In that year, a woman by the name of Mercy Lena Brown died. Now, before she passed away, her mother and older sister had both died of what they called consumption, we would call tuberculosis today. And then she and her brother got sick, and then she died. And there was suspicion that when close members of a family die like this in rapid succession, that one of them is actually a vampire that is hunting the others from the grave. So they exhumed the bodies of Mercy's older sister and her mother and Mercy. The mother and the sister were both in what we could call an appropriate state of decomposition, but Mercy looked awfully fresh. Now, it turns out she had died in the winter and her body had been kept in a outdoor, well, what amounted to be almost a freezer, and so her body was sort of preserved by that. And so when she went into the ground, she wasn't as decayed as they had expected her to be. And this led them to believe that she was a vampire. And so they cut out her heart and her liver, burned them, put this in a potion, and gave it to her brother who was sick in the hope that this would save him. As it turns out, he died 2 months later anyway. This is 1892, and this is only the most recent of a series of vampire scares that occurred in New England. We have, for example, the Jewett City vampires in Connecticut in 1854. 5 members of the Ray family were suspected of, had died, and so they suspected a vampire. One of them was determined to have been the cause of this we don't have really records on what happened, but we know that he was suspected to be a vampire because when his grave was opened up and was discovered recently and opened up, there was a bone disruption. They'd moved the bones around to prevent the body from coming back. We see something earlier also in Jewett City dating back to the 1790s. In Woodstock, Vermont, in 1817, a heart was burned out of fear of a vampire. Someone was exhumed and their heart was burned. Woodstock, Vermont, again in 1834, a complete corpse burning. Manchester, Vermont in 1793, organs were burned literally as a sacrifice to demon vampire. These kinds of things were going on in New England, and yet we never think of New England as a center for vampires. Now, why did this happen? The answer really is tuberculosis. The fact is that people didn't understand why people would pick up this disease and just sort of waste away. They had no idea what was causing it. They had no idea how to stop it. And so in something of a panic, when tuberculosis spread through a household, they assumed that there was something there that was hunting them, a member of the family usually. Now, where did this idea come from, though? This is a little bit weird. Where did they get this idea? Well, it clearly comes from Central Europe or Germany. The question is, how did it get there? It could have come from German immigrants. It could have come from Hessian soldiers that stayed in the country after the revolution. Remember, we're dealing with 1790s here in some cases. It could have come from sailors. We don't know. We do know that there is something of an influence coming in from Romania because that's where you get the idea of burning the organs and feeding the ashes to people to prevent the disease. But that's about as far as we can go. We don't really know. We do know that it goes back to Central Europe. So how did these ideas emerge in Central Europe? Why is there such a belief in vampires there? Well, it turns out you can trace the first real evidence we have of vampire scares into the 1600s. There was a thing that in German was called a Nachzehrer. This is described sometimes as the chewing dead. People would hear noises in cemeteries, things like that, and for various reasons they might exhume bodies, and they would find things like the shroud is in the mouth of the corpse. If the fingers and toes are decayed, it looks like maybe something has been chewing on them. And the assumption is that these chewing dead were not exactly dead completely, and that maybe they were coming back and attacking the living. And so what they would do when they found a corpse like this is they would put a brick or a stone in the mouth to keep them from chewing. And this was assumed to be enough to stop them from doing what they were doing. Now, it's worth noting that all of these cases where you see people having this done to their bodies, in all cases it's associated with plague or disease. So the early idea is that these kinds of undead are there to spread disease. It could be plague, it could be other things. This is similar to what we saw in New England later on with consumption, with tuberculosis. The idea of the chewing dead, we see it as early as, like I said, 1679 for sure, maybe earlier. We see it in Venice. It spreads to East Prussia in the early 18th century, and then throughout the Habsburg Empire, really by 1834. It's spreading between 1825 to 1834. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that this is right in the starting phases of the Enlightenment. So we're seeing a growth of a vampire craze taking place right at the time when the Enlightenment is starting. And that in itself is something of a hint for us. A couple of famous cases here that are worth noting are first the case of Petr Blagojevich, who died in 1725. After he died, there were 9 deaths in 8 days. His wife claimed that Petr had come to her and asked for his shoes after he died. His spirit or something had come to her and asked for his shoes, and she refused to give it to him, and he left in a huff. And then you start seeing all these deaths. An imperial officer by the name of Frombald was in the village, or went to the village to figure out what was going on and why all these people were in a panic. Because they were telling him, look, if you don't do something about this, we're going to abandon the village. We're going somewhere else. It's not safe to be here. So they exhumed Petr's body, and what they found is he was looking remarkably healthy. Ruddy skin, kind of plump. It looked like his fingernails and hair had grown. And this completely freaked out the villagers. So they got some local gypsies to take care of the body, by which I mean they put a stake through him, during which process, by the way, the report says he screamed. And then they burned the body. They also staked and burned all the people who had died as victims of his to keep them from coming back as vampire spawn. That was enough to make an imperial officer who is intrinsically skeptical about these things start wondering what is going on. And again, we are in the era of the Enlightenment here. The following year, a guy by the name of Arno Pavel died, 1726. He had been a hajduk, which is a militiaman in the Ottoman Empire. And he claimed that he had a vampire encounter in the Ottoman Empire, but that he had then eaten soil from the vampire's grave, which would give him protection against the vampire. He died in 1726, and within a month there were 4 more sudden deaths. People got suddenly ill and died. Some of them claimed that they had seen him. He was disinterred, and once again, the body looked more fresh than it should have. And he was staked and burned along with his victims. Now, that isn't the end of Pavel's story, however, because it turns out that in 1731, 5 years later, there was a second outbreak in the same village. 17 deaths in the space of 3 months. 2 of these were a woman named Militia, who had eaten a sheep that had supposedly been killed by Pavel, and then this would have conveyed vampirism to her, presumably. Another, Stana, had confessed having run into a vampire in the Ottoman Empire, and once again, to try to prevent the vampire from attacking her or killing her, she said, consumed some of the vampire's blood. An imperial scribe was out there to investigate, and his name was Glaser. He put in a report on this. They sent a military doctor by the name of Flukinger out. He oversaw the exhumations of the bodies, most of which were in what we could describe as an appropriate state of decay, but there were a couple that were not. And even, people who'd been buried more recently were more decayed than these were. Again, ruddy flesh, things like that. So once again, the gypsies came to their aid. They beheaded and burned Stana and Milica, along with 12 of the victims who showed signs that perhaps they were infected. Now remember, Flukinger is a military physician. He is a university-trained doctor, and what he saw, he could not explain. It really, frankly, scared him. Reports of these, especially the one of Arnaud Pavel, spread. And they were reprinted in Dutch in the Glaneur, the Mercure Galant in France, the London Journal, March 11th, 1732, and then the Country Journal in May of 1732. The picture you're looking at is actually the Country Journal of the date where this report is. And in fact, this is the page where it is reported. This is actually an interesting one because it is the first reference to these undead coming back and drinking blood. All of the others, they're just more or less sucking the life force out of people or causing illness or something like that. This is the first time you see a reference to these vampires actually drinking blood. A French clergyman by the name of Calmet published a book, the dissertation on apparitions of angels, demons, and vampires. And this spread the idea of vampires across Europe. The picture you're seeing here is a portrait of Calmet in the title page of his book. When this spreads across Europe, this book becomes very popular, and it spreads the ideas of vampires across Europe, and at this point, it really takes hold in the culture. Now, before we look at what I would describe as the start of the real vampire craze, let's talk about some medical explanations of what was really going on. The so-called chewing vampires. The sound could have been caused simply by processes of decay with bodies that are inadequately buried. There are things that can shift and move and cause grinding type sounds. The appearance, the shroud in the mouth is really easy. It just sort of collapsed in as the jaw opened and the body decayed. The chewing vampires are simple. Hair and nails growing, they don't. But the skin shrinks away from them, and so they look like they're growing. Skin tone, looking ruddy and all of that. There are various forms of decay that can take place that will cause this. The so-called fresh blood that they will see in the mouth and other parts of the vampires, the supposed vampires. Again, it is probably not blood, but a rather unusual but not unknown product of decay. The screaming when they're staked, well, the bodies are plump in part because the decay causes gases to build up within them. And then when you drive the stake into the body and break that, the gas escapes, and it will produce a sound. Many of these points were actually made by Maria Theresa of Austria's physician, Gerard von Swieten, who published a book in which he did his best to debunk vampires. He didn't want people believing in them. He thought that this was ridiculous, and Maria Theresa certainly didn't want this kind of chaos going on in her empire. And so there were early attempts to debunk the whole vampire thing, but they don't exactly go anywhere. As I said, as late as 1892, you're getting vampire scares across the pond in New England. However, vampires undergo a certain kind of transformation during this period. They become subjects of art, and particularly literary art. So in 1848, you see one of your first poems about vampires by Heinrich August Ossenfelder. It's called Der Vampir. Lord Byron is going to use vampires in a poem called The Giaour from 1813. This features Christians against Muslims, and there's a reference to vampires in connection with the Ottoman Turks. He was at Villa Diodati with a number of other people, including Mary Shelley. And they decided at this point that they should all write some kind of ghost story. Mary Shelley will write Frankenstein. Lord Byron started a work called The Burial, which he never completed. But The Burial also included this idea of a vampire returning. And then he basically got tired of the idea of vampires and said he wasn't going to do anything more with them. So there are, early on, there are a number of people who get involved in this, but it rapidly grows and spreads. John William Polidori, who was also an associate of Byron's and involved in the Villa Diodati group, he's going to write a book in 1819 called The Vampire. This was attributed to Byron. A lot of people thought Byron wrote it. Byron denied it. Polidori tried to claim it. It was still published under Byron's name. He introduces a vampire named Lord Riven. And in many ways, this is the first modern vampire story. You know, where you have someone coming back from the dead who is, he's visible. He is not just sort of a ghost sucking people's life force out of them. He appears in various contexts, actually coming close to seducing women, as you see in later stories, and so on. Unfortunately, Polidori never got credit for this, and a combination of depression and serious gaming deaths led to his suicide. The next really big thing that we see, in English at least, is Varney the Vampire in 1847. There were a whole series of Varney books. These were penny dreadfuls. These were just small, short books, cheap books that people would buy, mostly for the horror of it. Probably the best known in our culture is Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. This was a penny dreadful. Varney the Vampire was the first of a large series of these penny dreadfuls about this character. They're terribly inconsistent. Because they've got different authors at different times. But altogether, they run to nearly 600,000 words. There were a lot of things written about Varney the Vampire. And this is going to really push vampires into the public imagination in Britain. Like I said, the stories are inconsistent. Whether he wants to be a vampire, whether he's a victim that didn't really want this, there are all kinds of things that end up being contradictory in it. But nonetheless, it is a major milestone, as it were, in the development of popular conceptions of vampires. From here, though, things get really out of hand. There are at least 4 operas that I've been able to find that are written about vampires, almost all of which have the title in English, The Vampire. There are short stories and novels written. And these are not just penny dreadfuls. Gogol wrote a vampire story. Alexei Tolstoy, Dumas the Elder. Some really A-lister authors during this period are writing vampire stories. There are theaters that regularly have vampires. As a matter of fact, it was said in this period in Paris, there wasn't a single theater in Paris that didn't have its vampire. This just explodes at the level of popular culture during the 19th century. And this is the context in which Bram Stoker arrives. Bram Stoker was involved in theater early on. He knew a lot of very important people, including some of them who had written vampire stories. He was a friend of Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, Walt Whitman. He knew Teddy Roosevelt. He'd written a bunch of other works, but his biggest one is an epistolary novel called Dracula. An epistolary novel is a novel written in the form of letters. And the ideas for this came from a variety of sources. It came from Lord Riven. It came from a work called Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, another vampire story. It came from Varney the Vampire. He knew about Mercy Lena Brown, the woman who was exhumed in Exeter, Rhode Island that we started with. He'd heard her story. He had read a book on Transylvania superstitions written by Emily Gerard back in 1885. So he's familiar with a lot of these sources, and he brings them all together and synthesizes kind of a new comprehensive vision of the vampire in Dracula. Now, the original title of the book was going to be called The Dead Undead. He later changed it to simply The Undead. The original name of Dracula was going to be Count Vampire. Fortunately, he changed his mind on that. He changed it as a result of a book by William Willison called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, in which he heard the story of the historic Dracula in the first place. And so he decided to use that, the historic figure of Vlad Tepes, Vlad Dracula, as the, well, protagonist of the novel, and thus the name became Dracula. Now, just a quick side note on Vlad Dracula. He was a prince in a territory called Wallachia, roughly in modern-day Romania. Dracula means the son of the dragon, Dracul. His father was in the Order of the Dragon, so that's how he got his name. He was actually, in some ways, a hero, and still considered a hero in Romania, because he was resisting the advance of the Ottoman Turks. He was, however, guilty of committing huge numbers of atrocities. He was best known for impaling people. These could be either people who crossed him, or in one case, a vast number of Turkish prisoners that he left impaled in the line of march of the Turkish army, which caused them to turn around and leave. The commander said if he would do this kind of thing, there's no way we can fight someone who would do something this horrific. He was not terribly popular in Germany, however, because he also, well, he didn't much like the Germans. He didn't want the Germans dominating his country, and so he was guilty of atrocities against them. So he had a very bad reputation in Germany, but in Russia and Romania, he was still considered a hero. In any event, that was where Bram Stoker got his ideas. And in Bram Stoker, unlike in a lot of the other vampire stories that you see, he's a shapeshifter. He can turn into a bat. He can turn into a wolf. These are things that were really created by Bram Stoker, bringing in other elements of folklore, lycanthropy and things like that. Now, I'm not going to bother explaining all of the ins and outs of Dracula as he appears in Bram Stoker, because I assume that anybody who's watching this is somewhat familiar with that. But it's worth noting that Dracula had a lot of spawn. I checked at one point, and I was able to find, well, let's see, here's the count. 61 Dracula films, over 213 other vampire films, 8 made-for-television films, 64 television series featuring vampires, 55 episodes of other television shows in over 20 different series, 19 animated films, 7 web series, on and on and on. Dracula, building on the earlier vampire craze, has spawned an entire industry surrounding vampires. It is worth noting that one anthropologist studying American history made the argument that vampires tend to be popular when Republicans are in power and zombies when Democrats are in power. The idea is that Republicans are sort of aristocratic, and so the vampire will appeal to that, whereas the Democrats appeal to, not my words, but the guy who wrote this up, the Democrats appeal to the mindless masses, and hence you get zombie films. I'm not sure that holds as true over the last decade or two as it did when the person published this. But nonetheless, it is kind of an interesting point. But vampires have changed considerably since Dracula. there has been, well, I talked about other media. In literature, there are just too many to count. You have Marilyn Ross, the Barnabas Collins series. This is actually on television. The vampire appears here as a poetic, tragic hero, picking up one of the themes that we saw in Varney the Vampire. Anne Rice, the Vampire Chronicles, you get a sort of gothic or goth transgressive sexuality involved with them. You get a little hint of that in Dracula and even in Varney and some of the others. Whitley Strieber in The Hunger has vampires as a separate species. Kim Newman, the Anno Dracula series, has vampires as sort of postmodern heroes. The vampires have, well, Dracula was a shapeshifter. And maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that as we look at all of these various modern vampires, or postmodern vampires, that we should see the image of the vampire shifting as well. You even get paranormal romances involving vampires. So what are we to make of all of this? What is the lesson? What is the thing that we can draw from this, aside from historical curiosity about vampires? Well, first of all, I would point out that a lot of this really revolves around trying to understand ultimate questions of life and death. The early vampire scares had to do with situations in which people were dying from unexplained causes, wasting diseases in New England, plague in Venice, unexplained illnesses in Prussia and Austria. What do we do with that? How do we understand those? People didn't have a good way of explaining them, and so they turned to ancient superstitions about people rising from the dead and hunting the living, preying on family members, that sort of thing. And these tend to occur, particularly as you're moving into the post-plague era. These tend to be situations in which members of a family or a close community are all dying inexplicably. So the vampire there serves as a way of understanding what is going on and handling the fear of death, the fear of unexplained death. But when you're getting into the later period, when we're seeing, particularly in the 19th century, when we're seeing these literary vampires and artistic vampires appearing, what's going on there? Well, even during the Enlightenment, as we saw, there are these vampire scares. But the Enlightenment was an age in which there was a real push for reason, a real push to try to understand the world in terms of reason. And if there was one thing vampires are, it's unreasonable. There's no way that these things can be explained through reason. And so as the Enlightenment is growing, you have a counter to this that comes on, and this counter is a return to tradition, a return to superstition, because there's a lot of things that could not really be explained by reason. And so the vampire crazes that take place during the Enlightenment are, in part, I believe, not just a reaction to how do we explain these unexplained deaths, but they're also a reaction to the Enlightenment itself. And when you get into the 19th century and you see this explosion of vampire literature, short stories, novels, theater, operas, things like that, these things are flourishing in the 19th century, which is the era of scientism, the era in which modern science has developed and in which science ostensibly can explain everything. Except it can't. And so people, even though I don't think by the 19th century, for the most part, people are believing in vampires, though you do see it in New England, overall I don't think that people really believe in it. But nonetheless, the return to tradition, the return to superstition, becomes a vehicle through which they can question the prevailing scientism of the intelligentsia. In fact, you can understand Bram Stoker's Dracula as a battle between science and tradition. The scientific world cannot understand, cannot explain Dracula, cannot explain these horrific things that are going on. And it's only when you return to the traditional, it's only when you return to the ancient knowledge that is rejected by science that you can actually solve the problem. But then we move to the postmodern era, where we get vampiric romances and postmodern vampires and all of these kinds of things. tragic heroes. How do we understand that? Well, I would argue that there are two things at work here. One of them is that we do not live in a society anymore where we're confronted by death on a daily basis. The fact of the matter is people no longer die at home. They die in hospice. We no longer hold wakes in our home. You know, in New England, they had coffin doors in the kitchen so the people's coffins could be brought in and out of the house. We no longer have that. Wakes are held at churches or at funeral homes. We have done our utmost to isolate ourselves, to insulate ourselves from death. And you can't have traditional vampires in a culture that doesn't believe in death or that doesn't see death as a reality. We try to hide from it. We try to make believe it doesn't happen. And as a result, vampires, if you're going to have them, have to change. They cannot be focused around death quite so much. And so you get them as tragic heroes. We're in a postmodern era. Everyone wants to be a tragic hero. Everyone wants to be a victim. You get, as I said, romances. You get all kinds of things. And what's the romance about? It's the vampire lover who will bring you into eternal life by having you join him for eternity in his undead state. So I think that what we see in the modern vampire is a reflection of our culture, just like earlier vampires were a reflection of theirs. And then there is another part of this that is kind of worth noting. An associate professor of social work by the name of Williams from the University of Iowa and Emily Pryor from the Center for Positive Sexuality in Los Angeles published a paper in Critical Social Work back in 2015 that was called, "Do We Always Practice What We Preach? Real Vampires' Fears of Coming Out of the Coffin to Social Workers and Helping Professionals." It turns out there is a thankfully small group within society that thinks of themselves as real vampires, that genuinely drink blood, although not by sucking it from people's necks. And you have this vampiric subculture that's out there. Again, people who are, I would argue, mentally disturbed, but who are trying to come to grips, I would say, with questions, ultimate questions of life, death, and what it all means. So vampires have provided a tool for all of these things over the years, a way of handling questions about unexplained deaths, disease, a way of handling the things that the culture ignores as it moves toward increasing rationalism and scientism, and ultimately turning them into expressions of modern concerns, modern interests, modern priorities, modern precedents. So there's actually a lot that we can learn looking at the vampire through history, both about history and, frankly, about our own culture and about ourselves.